Here are some of the things that I wish I knew before going on my research trip to Antarctica. Last January, I went on a 20-day expedition down to the Antarctic for my PhD research. And I went with a touristic vessel company because they leave a lot of their spaces open to take scientists on board and help them get to Antarctica in order for them to perform their research. In this video, I'm going to discuss the things that I wish I knew prior to my expedition, because I think they could be really helpful for people who are interested in Antarctica or are planning to go there themselves. Let's start with the dreaded Drake Passage. I've had terrible motion sickness my entire life, so I was so nervous about crossing the Drake Passage. I followed all the guidance, I took different types of motion sickness tablets, and I'm happy to report that it still completely sucked. Most people still get sick regardless of the medication or anything else that they do. However, what I wish I knew beforehand is that it will still be okay regardless. Yes, you're most likely gonna spend 2 days straight either lying in your bed or puking your guts. But honestly, it's not nearly as bad as people build it up in their heads. I think the stress and anticipation of whether or not I'm gonna get sick on the Drake Passage made it probably 10 times worse. And I think it was really difficult getting there because you are not sure of how long this is gonna last. People tell you it's about 2 days, but if you've never been at sea before, you're still gonna think, oh, what if I'm gonna puke the entire trip? But the water in Antarctica is very still, so you'll have no issues once you get there, and it will be completely worth it once you get to Antarctica. What I found really strange though about crossing the Drake Passage is that myself and the other scientists that were in their 20s were literally lying in bed and puking our guts all the way through the Drake Passage. All while the senior folk on the ship were partying and drinking and doing karaoke on the top floor of the vessel. And the top floor is the one that shakes the most. So my group and I ended up feeling really lame about ourselves. Although the people partying probably also got sick, just for different reasons. Now let's move on to the things that happen once you reach Antarctica. The number one most important thing that I wish I knew was to bring a trash picker. So Antarctica has very strict rules. I discuss in more detail in this video. In summary, apart from the soles of your feet touching the ground, you're not allowed to touch anything else. You're not allowed to crouch, you're not allowed to place anything on the ground, and you're definitely not allowed to pick up anything from the continent. And all these rules make perfect sense to me. They're there to protect the environment. Although the environment is extremely harsh, it's also a really fragile ecosystem. There's no people that live in Antarctica, and it's so far away from the rest of the world. So it's never been exposed to some of the world's diseases and bacteria. And although Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth, which technically would kill most bacteria, most people visit it during polar summer, when it's between -1 and 4 degrees Celsius. So that's not cold enough to kill some of the bacteria that people might bring. The expedition companies need to adhere to these really strict rules and enforce them for all the visitors that they're bringing. However, accidents might still happen. The wind might blow objects away, or people might accidentally drop something on the ground. And this is well known within the expedition guides. So tell me why nobody brought a trash picker. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. This is very hard for me to share because I love Antarctica and I'm dedicating my life's work to protecting this environment. During my expedition, I accidentally polluted. I was not careful enough when I was handling my gear and I accidentally dropped my camera lens cover. It was similar to this one and it ended up falling in a deep crack in a rock. I think I spent about an hour trying to retrieve it by putting 2 hiking sticks together and trying to scoop it up. And some of the crew members also tried to help me. And all I kept thinking throughout that entire panic was how much I wish I had my trash picker from back home. It would have literally been so easy to retrieve it with it. One expedition crew member saw how upset I was, and he tried to make me feel better by telling me that this happens all the time. What do you mean this happens all the time and nobody brought a trash picker? I don't want to blame the crew members for my own mistake. I'm just saying, if you're going to Antarctica, please bring your own trash picker. And speaking about the crew members, I wanted to mention just how impressive the staff from an expedition company is. The team members of the company were mostly split between expedition guides and hospitality staff. The expedition guides are mostly researchers hired by the company to give lectures and engage the visitors in research activities. And they also lead the visitors in general when they go out on the continent. The hospitality staff are the people that clean the rooms or cook the food. And you would think that they would stick to their main roles, but everybody was performing about 100 jobs. All the staff members were involved in so many parts of the operations, from driving the Zodiac boats to looking after people when they're visiting places on the continent. Every crew member on the ship was extremely impressive and they had the most amazing background. Some of them used to track whale populations in British Columbia, while others used to research turtles in the Maldives. Also, the work they do on a ship during an Antarctic expedition is so intense. They work such long hours and they have a very interesting working schedule. The expedition guides spend 2 months at sea doing voyages down the Antarctic, and then they have 2 months off. But I felt like the work of the hospitality staff was probably the most intense. They are at sea for half a year, and then they have 2 months off as well. And a lot of them had families and children back home, so they spent so much time away from them. And every time they would speak about their home, their eyes would just light up, and you could tell how much they missed their families. Another thing that really surprised me about Antarctica was the greenery. When people think of Antarctica, they generally imagine this white continent, but it is so much more colorful than I could have ever expected. You can find places with moss, and there's also pink and green snow algae. And what's more, the midnight sun creates some of the most stunning colors. Although during polar summer the sun doesn't fully set, it still has movement, so you can watch it rise and set in just a few hours and witness the most beautiful sky that I've ever seen. Speaking about polar summer, another thing that I wish I knew is that it's gonna be probably warmer than you expect. You still need to pack all the necessary layers, but I was way too stressed. Again, in anticipation of how cold it's going to be. For example, I bought a stupid amount of hot hands. If you don't know what these are, they're just packets that heat up that you can put in your gloves or in your socks. And I think I only used them twice after the polar plunges. But now I have like 40 and I have no idea what I'm gonna do with them. I also went insane when I bought sunglasses. I bought 3 pairs, 1 for backup and 2 because I was scared that the metal frame of my glasses is gonna freeze. And guess what? It was fine. And I just wore my original sunglasses the entire trip. As I said, most voyages to Antarctica take place during polar summer, and they generally take place around the western Antarctic Peninsula, which doesn't get as cold as the rest of the continent. So I will say that the thing I wish I stressed more about was sunscreen. I wish I took care of my hands as much as I took care of my face. The ozone layer around Antarctica isn't really strong, so it's very important to protect your skin with sunscreen. However, I didn't really put a lot of sunscreen on my hands because I used to cover them with gloves. But there were so many times on the continent when I took my gloves off in order to handle my camera, which was a huge mistake. I should have really taken better care of my hands because I ended up with the worst skin allergy. The doctor couldn't tell if it got caused by the sun, but it definitely got worse because of the sun exposure. And it got to the point where the doctor just told me that I'm probably allergic to the environment in Antarctica. Let's get some things clear. I've spent years working and trying to become a researcher in the Antarctic. I don't think the doctor realized how much it actually hurt to tell me that. So even if I'm allergic, bring it on. So yeah, maybe all of this could have been avoided if I put as much sunscreen on the other parts of my body as I did on my face. So don't be dumb like me. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how penguins stink. I read about this beforehand, but when we got to Antarctica, we started by visiting smaller colonies of penguins. So initially, I didn't understand what people were complaining about, because the smaller colonies do smell, but it's not horrible. However, was I in for a big shock when we got to the large colonies. Not only do they reek, but the smell will get through and stay in your clothes for days afterwards. So what I wish I knew was that you can do laundry on most vessels, but it is quite pricey. It depends on the item of clothing, but I'd say on average, it costs around 15 to 20 euros to wash one item. So I wish I came in a bit more prepared, knowing that I will have to wash some of my clothing because it will stink of penguin poo. Speaking of clothing, another thing that I wish I knew was to pack more clothes for Argentina. Most Antarctic expeditions leave from Argentina, and most people fly initially to Buenos Aires and then to Ushuaia, which is the southernmost city, and then you start sailing from Ushuaia. And I completely forgot to pack anything for Buenos Aires. So I was walking about in wool pants in 30 degrees weather. Also, a lot of things can change during your voyage, so you might end up spending more days in Argentina than originally planned. Because of the protests happening around the country, we ended up spending 2 days extra in Argentina. So make sure to pack at least 1 pair of shorts and a t-shirt. Another thing that really surprised me was how many lectures were organized by the researchers on the trip. You could attend them in person or you could watch them from the TV in your room. They're honestly so cool. They talked about whales and glaciers and a lot of Antarctic science. And we even got a lecture on relationships in Antarctica. And honestly, that makes so much sense because the team members spend so many months together in the most remote location in the world, and watching some of them interact And the last thing that really surprised me, this is from my fellow Scotsman. I'm not Scottish, but I've been living in Scotland for almost 3 years, and it was so cool to learn how many places in Antarctica are actually named after Scotland. There's Dundee Island, Edinburgh Hill, Scotland Edge, to name a few. But this is not necessarily for the best reasons. In the 1800s, Scotland became significantly involved in the whaling industry. So a lot of Scottish sailors were going down to the Antarctic to kill whales and almost drove them extinct. That's how a lot of places ended up being named after Scotland. However, the evolution of the relationship between Antarctica and Scotland is fascinating, because towards the end of the 1900s, Scottish explorers became some of the pioneers of Antarctic exploration, and they gathered some of the earliest climate measurements in Antarctica, which now lay the foundation for Antarctic climate science. I literally work at Discovery Point, which is an Antarctic center in Dundee, Scotland. And this center is the home of RRS Discovery, which was the ship used by Shackleton to go and do research expeditions in Antarctica. And at the same time, Dundee was one of the major ports where whaling fleets would live from to go down to the Antarctic and hunt whales for their blubber and other parts. I think this connection between Antarctica and Scotland really puts things into perspective. From almost driving whales extinct, which are my favorite animal, by the way, to then advancing Antarctic climate science, to now Scotland becoming extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding, most of which is caused by the increasing temperatures down in the Antarctic. So I think the connection between Antarctica and Scotland is a great example of how Antarctica actually affects our daily lives, even if it's the most remote location on the planet. So these were some of the things that I wish I knew prior to my research expedition. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions down in the comments below. My name is Maria. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in my next video.